Does economic inequality inevitably lead to problems of political inequality? Karl Marx's foundational axiom, articulated in his 1859 preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, postulates that the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. This establishes society as comprising an economic base, substructure, and a political legal superstructure, where the former fundamentally shapes the latter. While acknowledging reciprocal influence, Marx insisted that control over the means of production, the core of economic relations, ultimately determines political hierarchy. Economic inequality intrinsically generates political inequality by concentrating the resources necessary to influence or control the state apparatus within a dominant economic class. However, this relationship is not static, and revolutionary ruptures temporarily invert this logic during transitions between distinct economic systems. From an economic perspective, there are four critical epochs. Traditional agricultural societies where land and slave ownership gave direct governance. Early modern bourgeois societies where ascended capital violently displaced feudal political monopolies. Industrial societies where labor's vital economic contribution forced limited political concessions, and emergent post-industrial economies threatening widespread political disenfranchisement. Economic dominance inevitably seeks political incarnation, making political inequality inevitable in traditionally materialist societies. Things could change if we are witnessing the advent of Marx's communism, a society where the economy becomes secondary to the public benefit, not through suppression but through abundance. The link between economic control and political authority defined pre-modern societies. In ancient Rome, the patrician aristocracy derived power from vast agricultural estates worked by slaves. As historian Theodor Mommsen established, the Senate, dominated by landowners, held supreme authority during the Republic, while the Centuriate Assembly weighted votes by wealth, ensuring the elites controlled outcomes. Plebeians initially faced exclusion, but their political emancipation through the conflict of the orders was intrinsically tied to wealth accumulation. The Lex Licinia Sextia opened consulships to plebeians precisely as wealthy commoners emerged. By the late Republic, the 400,000 sesterces wealth requirement for equestrian rank created a commercial elite, co-opted into governance, blurring patrician and plebeian lines. Medieval Europe inherited this logic through land-based feudalism. Lords exercised judicial, military, and fiscal authority tied directly to their manors. Historian Stephen Rugby observes that, according to common understanding in medieval times, knights possessed wealth by natural right due to their superior virtue in defending the common good. Serfs bound to the land had no political voice, while nobility required land holdings, generating specific knight service revenues. Asian empires operated similarly but with heightened centralization. The Han Dynasty in China enforced the equals field system, theoretically redistributing land, yet imperial monopolies on salt, iron, and grain allowed the state to control surplus. Officials drew salaries from state granaries, binding their loyalty to the throne's economic apparatus. The Tang Dynasty's 9-rank system later formalized political appointments requiring minimum land holdings, 120 mo. Resistance existed, but rarely succeeded. Roman slave revolts, for example Spartacus, and medieval peasant uprisings like the Jacquerie were crushed without sustained economic leverage. Only when plebeians accumulated capital could they breach political barriers, a pattern repeated when medieval burghers used commercial wealth to challenge feudal lords in the Renaissance. The universal rule remained: political voice was a function of economic standing, whether through lands, slaves, or state-controlled surplus. As historian Moses Finlay concluded, in no pre-industrial society did the propertyless exercise sustain political power. The rise of mercantile capitalism during the early modern period generated an irreconcilable tension between Europe's growing commercial economy and its established feudal political order. As merchant capital accumulated in the hands of bankers, long-distance traders, and commercially minded gentry, these bourgeois elites demanded political rights proportionate with their growing economic influence. This struggle, rooted in what historian Fernand Braudel identified as merchant capital's inherent drive to transcend territorial boundaries and create its own special logic within emergent global markets, unfolded through both revolutionary upheavals and institutional subversion when landed aristocracies resisted power sharing. The bourgeois journey to political recognition reveals how economic power inevitably seeks political expression. It also demonstrates the new elite's determination to exclude subordinate classes from its hard-won privileges. By the 16th century, mercantile networks had generated unprecedented wealth through mechanisms that bypassed traditional agrarian power structures. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, established in 1602, exemplified this new economic order. Its annual profits from Asian trade surpassed 18 million guilders by the 1660s, exceeding noble land revenues. Financial innovations like bills of exchange and state-backed banking enabled capital mobility across borders, while manufacturing growth in textiles and metallurgy created prosperous urban centers independent of aristocratic control. Yet feudal institutions actively suppressed this ascendant class. Spain's master monopoly privileged noble wool producers over textile manufacturers, while French internal tariffs stifled domestic commerce. Most provocatively, nobles exempted themselves from taxes like Francis Taille, shifting fiscal burdens onto merchants and peasants, while guild regulations controlled by aristocrats blocked industrial innovation. To dismantle feudal privilege, the bourgeoisie employed sophisticated strategies that revealed their growing sophistication as a political force. Enlightenment philosophers provided ideological weaponry by reframing political legitimacy around productive wealth rather than birth. Merchants and artisans, not idle landlords, were declared the true creators of national prosperity, deserving representation. This intellectual revolution found explosive expression in Abessie's 1789 pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, which stated, "What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been hitherto in the political order? Nothing." Yet ideology required popular mobilization to succeed. Bourgeois leaders strategically harnessed peasant and artisan discontent against feudal exactions. This uneasy alliance enabled critical victories like the storming of the Bastille and the August 4, 1789 decree abolishing feudal privileges. Post-revolution, the bourgeoisie entrenched power through proprietary censuses and legal mechanisms, ensuring only the property classes governed. Landed elites in some countries like England retained cultural prestige but ceded economic primacy to financiers and colonial merchants, while post-1688 voting requirements excluded 98% of the population by mandating £40 annual land income for parliamentary suffrage. France's 1791 constitution created active citizens limited to tax-paying males, just 13% of adult men, while Napoleon's civil code sanctified bourgeois property rights while criminalizing workers' coalitions. When Parisian sans-culottes demanded universal male suffrage in 1793, the bourgeoisie responded with the terrorist guillotines. The mercantile elite's triumph created wealth-based oligarchies across Europe. Their controlling mechanisms ensured that political power reflected the new economic hierarchy. Capital replaced land as the determinant of influence, yet the abyss between propertied and propertyless widened. The bourgeoisie's co-option of aristocratic lifestyles, acquiring country estates, commissioning courts of arms, and marrying into noble families, demonstrated their successful fusion with old elites rather than a genuine democratization of power. As Western European societies transitioned from agrarian economies to industrial powerhouses, the concentration of workers in factories and urban centers transformed labor into a critical factor of production. The structural shift enabled workers to obtain significant political concessions, particularly through expanded suffrage and labor protections, yet these gains remained alienated by capitalist hierarchies and, in communist experiments, bureaucratic elites. The era demonstrated that, while economic indispensability could translate into political rights, the distribution of those rights was invariably mediated by pre-existing power structures. Industrialization created conditions where labor's collective power became indispensable to value creation. Factory production required the coordination of thousands of workers in sectors like textiles, iron, and coal mining, creating dense urban communities capable of organized action. This spatial concentration allowed labor to disrupt production through strikes, forcing capital and the state to negotiate. The cotton industry exemplified this dynamic. Inventions like the spinning gantry and power loom centralized production in mills where workers could collectively hold output, as demonstrated by the Lancashire strikes of 1818 and 1842. World War I marked a watershed. Mass conscription of armed workers while creating labor shortages, which enabled unprecedented demands. In Britain, the Representation of the People Act granted suffrage to all male workers over 21 and women over 30, partly in recognition of their wartime sacrifices, expanding the electorate from 8 to 21 million. Labor's political ascent was further catalyzed by socialist movements that threatened revolutionary upheaval. Fearing insurrection, capitalist states implemented reforms. Bismarck's Germany pioneered social insurance to undermine socialist appeal, while Britain's Trade Union Act legalized collective bargaining after decades of Chartist agitation. The Fordist Compromise represented the zenith of this power sharing, where high wages, unionization, and welfare states temporarily aligned capital and labor interests. Darren Asemoglu observed that technological innovation during this period often created skilled tasks complementing labor, enabling sustained wage growth and consumption. Despite these gains, capital retained decisive control through three mechanisms. The first one is institutional barriers. Liberal democracies maintained property-based exclusions within ostensibly democratic systems. Britain's 1832 Reform Act enfranchised only men with property worth £10 annually, excluding 80% of adult males. Even after 1918, electoral districts often overrepresented industrialist interests. The second one is ideological and legal constraints. Economic liberalism, enshrined by Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, sanctified private property while framing state intervention as inefficient. Napoleon's Civil Code criminalized workers' coalitions, while Britain's Combination Acts imposed harsh penalties for union organizing. Courts routinely sided with capital, as in the 1806 Philadelphia cordwainers case, where journeyman shoemakers were convicted of conspiracy for striking. The third one is the bureaucratic subversion in communist states, where revolutions abolished private capital, as in the USSR. Power shifted not to workers but to a bureaucratic nomenclatura. Soviet officials controlled production quotas and resource allocation, enjoying privileges like special housing and access to scarce goods. Milovan Djilas identified this as a new class whose political authority derived from administrative control rather than ownership, proving that the expropriation of the bourgeoisie did not lead to workers' control but to the rule of apparatchiks. Workers liked genuine workplace democracy, and strikes remained illegal until 1989. Industrial technology, though initially empowering labor through concentration, gradually reinforced capital's dominance. James Watt's steam engine centralized production in factories owned by capitalists who alone could afford machinery. Workers became appendages to machines, and losing skills through assembly lines pioneered by Henry Ford reduced individual bargaining power. Even labor's wartime influence proved contingent. After 1945, automation and globalization began eroding industrial employment, foreshadowing labor's decline in leverage in late capitalism. The Industrial Revolution thus revealed a paradox. Labor's economic centrality forced political recognition, but the ownership of capital, whether private or state-controlled, remained the ultimate determinant of power. As Karl Marx observed, the factory system perfected the division of labor within society, while intensifying the concentration of the means of production in the hands of a few. The structural foundations of industrial-era political bargaining have collapsed under the weight of digital capitalism, creating conditions where economic redundancy translates directly into political disenfranchisement. This epochal shift, characterized by the triple forces of automation, financialization, and platformization, has generated Guy-Standing's precariat, a class defined by unstable labor, fragmented identities, and the absence of occupational futures. Unlike the proletariat, whose collective workplace power once forced concessions from capital, The precariat lacks structural leverage in an economy where algorithms manage automized tasks and wealth accrues through asset inflation rather than production. This erosion of labor's economic value proposition has enabled ideologies that explicitly advocate for the political elimination of quote-unquote surplus populations, transforming Marx-based superstructure dynamic into a dystopian horror. Industrial society granted workers political capital through their indispensability in factories and mines, but digital capitalism systematically dismantles this leverage. Automation now threatens 70% of tasks in advanced economies, with Foxconn's lights-out factories and AI diagnostic tools replacing both manual and cognitive labor. Platformization fractures work into microtasks. Uber drivers retain merely 77% of fares after corporate fees and vehicle costs, while Amazon Mechanical Turk workers bid for piecemeal digital labor at near-poverty wages. Crucially, wealth generation has detached from labor entirely, shifting to asset ownership and financial speculation. By 2023, the top 1% captured 63% of new global wealth, primarily through real estate stocks and cryptocurrencies. This decoupling creates what Yuval Noah Harari terms the useless class, humans who function neither as producers nor soldiers, but as consumers of last resort in a system that no longer requires their labor. Harari's Homo Deus projection that biotechnology and AI will render most humans economically obsolete ceases to be speculative when gig workers earn below subsistence wages while training the algorithms destined to replace them. The precariat's economic redundancy manifests politically through institutional and technological exclusion. Algorithmic governance replaces democratic accountability. China's social credit system restricts travel and employment for low-scoring citizens, while predictive policing software like PredPol targets marginalized neighborhoods, automating the criminalization of poverty. Western democracies dismantle social contracts through legislation. The erosion of collective bargaining rights is compounded by surveillance capitalism, where platforms like Uber deploy real-time data to cross-descent, flooding New York with surge pricing during driver strikes to incentivize cab labor. This institutional shift reflects a deeper ideological transformation, where industrial capitalism exploited workers for their labor value. Digital capitalism perceives the precariat as a fiscal drain, justifying welfare retrenchment and punitive policies. Stanton identifies this as a shift from exploitation to exterminism, where the economically redundant face not oppression but eradication from politics. This dehumanization finds its theoretical scaffolding in the Dark Enlightenment, a reactionary movement that advocates discarding democratic equality as incompatible with capitalist efficiency. DE thinkers like Curtis Yarvin argue that 80% of humanity lacks cognitive surplus worth managing, rendering their political participation irrational. Yarvin's Rage Doctrine, retire all government employees, calls for presidential power to purge civil services, liquidate universities, and replace democracy with corporate sovereignty, a vision he terms the patch for liberal democracy's failures. This ideology gains material power through its adoption by tech oligarchs. Peter Thiel, Yarvin's key financier, publicly declared freedom and democracy incompatible, while Elon Musk's restructuring of Twitter modeled Yarvin's corporatist governance, firing 80% of staffs to centralize control. Such figures operationalize DE principles by lobbying against wealth taxes and promoting biometric monitoring, framing disenfranchisement as a technological necessity. Precariat resistance remains fragmented precisely because it lacks the structural foothold that empowers industrial labor. Movements like Francis Gillette's erupt over immediate grievances like fuel taxes, but dissipate without coherent leadership, crushed by drone surveillance and mass arrests. Digital organizing proves self-defeating. Platform-based strikes expose activists to algorithmic retaliation, while centralized networks like Occupy Wall Street lack the workplace choke points that enabled union power. This impotence stems from the precariat's asymmetric vulnerability. Factory workers could hold production, Uber drivers possess no equivalent leverage. Worse, as capital migrates to blockchain and AI, ownership concentrates among those controlling digital infrastructure. Harari's prognosis thus materializes. The precariat faces not exploitation but ontological irrelevance, perceived by elites as friction in the machine rather than participants in value creation. The convergence of forces of technological displacement, financial abstraction, and neo-reactionary ideology threaten a rupture in the historical link between economic contribution and political rights. Where industrial workers became dangerous when armed during world wars, the digital precariat is disarmed by its very superfluity. Standing segmentation of the precariat into disenfranchised groups, traditional workers, educated youth, migrants, obscures their unified trajectory, descent into a politically null category. The grim logic culminates in Harari's warning: when humans transition from exploited labor to quote-unquote useless eaters, elites may rationally choose neglect or choose those who survive. The base superstructure relationship thus reaches its terminal phase. Without economic function, the precariat loses not only political voice but moral standing in the civic order. To evade the techno-fascist dystopia envisioned by dark enlightenment thinkers and realize communism's unfulfilled promise of human dignity, we must transcend the materialist paradigm that has defined political economy since the Neolithic Revolution. This requires a dual transformation. First, establishing universal basic wages, linked from traditional labor value, ensuring material security as a foundational right. Second, creating a participatory economy where citizens earn non-transferable social impact points for contributions to societal flourishing. Carbon reduction, community care, Creative Commons, or ecological stewardship, measured through decentralized ledgers. These points would grant proportional influence in deliberative assemblies, ensuring political power reflects holistic human worth rather than capital accumulation. Such a system synthesizes Marx's aspiration for a post-scarcity society, where from each according to ability to each according to need is enabled by automation with the recognition that human purpose must shift beyond economic utility. Is labor in essence mandatory for life, or is it just another societal implication? By rewarding regenerative actions over extractive production, we replace both communist productivism and capitalist exploitation with an ethics of care. When cheap energy, robotization, and AI meet basic needs, humanity's historic enslavement to material production ends. We then face communism's deepest challenge: building a society where power derives not from what one owns or produces, but from how one nurtures life and sustainable development. Only here, beyond the tyranny of GDP, can we render dark enlightenment exterminism unthinkable.